The opposite of poverty is not wealth. The opposite of poverty is enough. I'd like to suggest that there are several positive aspects to the SDGs, including SDG 1, one of which is the idea that it was an embedded and inclusive process among CSOs, NGOs, and different community constituencies. I'd also like to commend it for including gender references across several different platforms and several different targets, unlike the predecessors, the MDGs, that somewhat ghetto-sized the gender question. I would also like to think that, in fact, it's a progression on the MDGs because it makes a very important assertion that low-income countries, especially of the global south, or what I sometimes call the majority world, have different starting points, completely different histories and hair stories, completely different social and national contexts, and that the SDGs set goals for countries and yet allow for adaptation of local contexts and local region. These are very important progressions. And this standalone objective that is especially aimed at eradicating disparity between the global north and the global south, as well as the recognition and destruction of national hierarchies, shows a respect of the underlying causes of poverty and the other far-reaching systemic challenges and problems, including gendered inequality, racism, ableism, casteism, colonialism, and other economic imbalances. So this marks a significant progressive move. All of that said, one of the critiques would be that the SDGs, regard of social economic systems, sometimes help to generate more poverty by not taking care of the structural circumstances and the structural dilemmas that this world and these economic systems produce and reproduce. The World Bank, the IMF, the WTO, all replicate colonial power relations through racialized, regionalist, sexist policies, promoting conventional economic models, prioritizing growth over other possibilities, despite the failure of many years of structural adjustment and other unadjustable prescripts that have been set by the Bretton Woods institutions. These often imply that African and other majority world countries implicitly lack the ability to govern our own resources and to act as equitable and distributive states. Indeed, these inequalities are entrenched in the traditional models for development and economics, which I'll say a bit more about later. But somehow these SDGs, including SDG 1, don't necessarily question these models. They land in an ideal world scenario. Successful implementation of the SDGs would mean not only that poverty and marginalization are reduced, and I'd like to say eradicated, it would also mean that ecological sustainability is enhanced, that the gap between the most powerful and the least powerful nations is minimized, and that the most powerful and the least powerful within countries, within communities and societies is also minimized. Implicit in the SDGs is the idea that economic growth and feminist equality are directly related, taking for granted existing growth-centric mainstream development models, which are sometimes blind to basic structural defects. Indeed, there's no fundamental challenge in the SDGs to the economic model of development pursued over the past 40 years, which has focused on resource extractive and intensive economic growth as a precondition for progressive redistributive policies. And the 2030 agenda does not propose a strategy for structural reform per se to eradicate poverty and the racism and colonial logic that underpin it, nor does it challenge existing trade or financial systems. And at the basis of this, I would like to suggest and propose that a decolonial feminist theory is an understanding of the macroeconomic dimensions of these concerns. Black and brown women in particular are among the most impoverished and depleted groups globally. And yet it is us who are the ones who are subsidizing global economics, wealth creation, social and market production, and reproduction. Despite all of this, despite our hugely disproportional contributions to global economics and wealth generation for this planet, and our preservation of this planet through ecological and agricultural endeavors, for example, why are we the most impoverished, the most deprived, the least acknowledged, the lowest paid? And in turn, this global division of labor is connected to a non-democratic system of decision-making that generates and reproduces poverty as a governance system that seems to support whiteness and seems to support Northern Euro-US interests primarily. Add to this that, in fact, we, Black and brown women, contribute up to 60% to a nation's GDP. And yet, why are we in this particular socioeconomic structure? This also calls for us to rethink basic definitions, and I'd like us to take a walk. The so-called rich countries of the global north in relation to the so-called poor countries of the global south. One might rather call global south or majority world countries depleted, disenfranchised, dispossessed economically. And one might perhaps call the global north, one of my good colleagues, Ashish Kapoor, who calls them decaying and rapacious countries, countries that behave with impunity, without compassion, and which themselves are turning in and decaying in their own context of the global north. And this requires that the minority world or the global north take greater accountability for the state of this world. The world is not flat. None of us, this is coincidental, and none of us got here by some fluke of chance. The world is not a football match where everybody plays equally. It is true to say that this requires us to remember that the production of poverty, the money, the resources, the minerals, the intellectual power, the intellectual capital, human capital that have been extracted, stolen, and violently taken out of the African continent since the transatlantic trade in African people, known as the transatlantic slave trade, then continued through colonial taxes and infinite natural resources forcibly taken from the continent throughout the colonial era, and the continued extraction through deliriously inequitable trade and economic arrangements that mirror colonial power dynamics. So this is a call for reparative economics. Reparative economics center on healing, on forms of repair, and acknowledges responsibility. This privilege that has been curated by the logic of old imperialisms and their afterlife in the multilateral Bretton Woods systems and by multinational companies that often have jurisdictional power on par with nation states and sometimes far greater power than African nation states. Several scholars have argued, in fact, that the aid discourse must then be changed and argue that the idea that reparations as a form of aid, or aid as a form of reparations or financial recompensation from former colonies colonizers is misguided and contributes to the perpetuation of harm. It's not just money, but money does help. Economics does help. So how do we then think through the sort of development theory and deconstruct the kind of development theory that underpins our global logic, our governance logic? This means that we have to think around what Stuart Hall, the great cultural theorist, dubbed the Bible of decolonization when he was quoting Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. Fanon explains how racism represented an organizing principle for capitalist elites by progressively depreciating the lives of the bulk of the world's population. And he says here, for centuries, they have behaved like actual war criminals in the underdeveloped world, which I guess is our world. Deportation, massacres, forced labor, and slavery were the principles, means employed by capitalism to enhance its gold and diamond reserves and establish its wealth and power. And again, this has a direct impact on the construction of poverty. There is no zero-sum total. There is no zero-sum game. There is an extractive historical relationship between the global south and the global north. So placing SDGs inside this very complex matrix uncritically ignores the likelihood that the model is essentially defective. Today, the growing movement for a fairer, more equitable, more radically transformed world, and the great awareness of how these are rooted in capitalism's deep, deep history, reflect the disparities of modern times and an increasing interest in moving towards true decolonization and true liberatory frameworks, as exhibited by the fact that the world is changing. It's not just a bipolar world, it is a multipolar world with multiple forms of power from countries which previously perhaps were not part of the big two poles of the East and the West. There's India, there's China, there is South Africa, there's Brazil, there's Turkey. The world is not what it was 30 or 40 years ago, and surely our global discourses on what poverty actually means need to shift to understand this. Added to this is that the aid development sector thrives on poverty. It thrives on the idea that, in fact, despite talking about the mantra of working themselves or working ourselves out of a job, this is an industry that benefits the intellectual, technical, professional, financial prospects of countless young Europeans and Americans, thrust, often unprepared, on increasingly unwilling recipients to help out at disproportionately senior positions over heads of older or more seasoned locals. Poverty, colleagues, is big business, and it is profitable business. So especially in the global south, it's an intellectual assault on the very existence of the state. So the scope for living meaningful lives is particularly and severely impaired under these contexts. Let us think more broadly about what poverty actually means. And I'd like again for us to think out of the box. In thinking and defining and redefining poverty beyond the $2 a day, which is hopelessly insufficient, I would like to suggest that this also includes the denial of enjoyment of the triad of political, civil, and social citizenship rights that help us to conceptualize who does and doesn't belong in a society, poverty and social exclusion. And I'd like to also suggest several other definitions and broadening of definitions beyond material conditions. Poverty of speech being one, poverty of social capital being another, poverty of power being a very important one, poverty of leisure being a very important one. Poverty of life choices, the ability to reimagine possibilities beyond the here and the now. Poverty of bodily, physical, and emotional well-being, including hopelessness, discouragement, to see beyond the fragility of the day-to-day and to imagine beyond the fluidity of the here and the now. The inability to even help to build the state and the state project, the poverty of autonomous movement, freedom of association, and of course, poverty of time. And I'd like to dwell on this for those of us who sat in traffic for way longer than we wanted to this morning. When we think around decolonizing time, work, and leisure. This is actually a form of sovereignty. And your neoliberal capitalist model will tell you that time is short. You snooze and you lose. Walala wasala. And I'd like to suggest that time is sovereign. And poverty makes us feel that it is in fact a scarce resource, and yet it is the most abundant thing, like sunshine in the sky. So poverty surpasses the insufficient material resources, involves many other indications that demand extension of our thinking, of our definitional elasticity to cover the rights to dignity, to autonomy, to participation, the opportunity to be part of decision-making, but to also understand the tangible and the intangible dimensions of what it means to have impoverishment of hope, of aspiration, way beyond economic and material lack. But indeed, material abundance also matters. And in closing, the options. Firstly, follow the money close that tap. The amount lost annually by African countries through IFFs is likely to exceed $50 billion per year by a significant amount, and this is double the inflows that we receive. We must close that tap. Secondly, we have to think beyond GDP and utilizing this metric of gross domestic product. It is just not working. It's an imperfect indicator for accessing economic welfare. It solely embraces the revenue of a nation and whatever the cost of that revenue. And we have to divest from that. In fact, even the originator of GDP, Simon Kuznets, said the correlation between national income and the well-being of a nation is weak. These well-being indices also closely resemble those that are held by a significant number of individuals in the majority world. So if we think about well-being, it rejects the concept of perpetual growth. There are countries like the Aotearoa, currently known as New Zealand. There is a concept called Te Maori, which speaks to well-being, the condition of experiencing internal peace, the condition of understanding that physical health is an important component of well-being and it's an important part of being wealthy. There's the ease of living index that comes out of China, and it evaluates the standard of living, economic capacity, and sustainability. In Ecuador, in Bolivia, there are many, many examples that are coming out of the global south, the majority world, people who look a lot more like us that we can learn from and exchange ideas with. I'd also like to add that feminist well-being also helps us to give the languaging of understanding that this is not it. That this kind of rapacious, flat binaries of how we define poverty are not it. And circular economies, solidarity economies, they help us to root in a possibility that we can have different local and global systems. And in closing, I'd like to quote Arundhati Roy, who says, "Poverty, after all, is not just a question of having no money or no possessions. Poverty is about having no power. The battle of the poor and the powerless is one of reclamation and not renunciation." Thank you.